This is Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from An Expat's Russia, where we answer your questions about what it's like to live, work, and travel in Russia.
Hey everyone, this is a sponsored video, really interesting request that we got to kind of break down a very specific situation from one of our subscribers. So we'd like to go through it, and hopefully it will help other people out, and we'll probably do something similar in the future. Matt, can you go ahead and give us the scenario and we can break it down?
Sure. So this comes from our subscriber, Edward. I'm going to read through it here and we'll kind of take it piece by piece because it's quite long. So he says, a bit of background about me and my story. I was born in Moscow in 1985 to Russian parents and currently live in Florida. I'm 36 years old, married, and have a 4.5-year-old daughter who has not started school in the U.S. yet. After I was born in Moscow, my mother decided along with my grandparents to take me and my brother out of Russia and move the family to Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up. I grew up in the U.S. since I was 7 years old, and I'm an American citizen. When I was 18, I served in the U.S. Army, was injured, and medically retired after a few years. I never thought about ever moving to Russia until now, and here's why. So this is interesting. We actually get quite a few questions from people who have some sort of military pension or they're retired. And this guy's a bit young, 36, but still he's got some sort of passive income here, I guess, we can call it. About 2 years ago, my father, who I was estranged from since we left Russia in 1993, found me and we started building a relationship. I'm lucky that I still speak fluent Russian, so earlier this year I flew back to Moscow to reunite with him and my relatives there for 2 weeks. It was great. Upon my return to the States, I began to think about moving back to Russia. My pension from the VA is around $5,000 a month here in the US, so there we go, got some income. And my wife works as a registered nurse here in Florida. We have no family here in the US and no family support. Her family now mostly all deceased and estranged, so it's just us three. My daughter has not started any type of school here as of yet. My wife and I own a house in Florida where we live, and we pay a low mortgage. Despite both of us making decent money, we live check to check like most people and cannot save money due to cost of living in America. Well, I don't know, I think Florida's one of the cheaper places to live, so that's kind of surprising if you've got two people working. But in any case, in Russia, it's definitely $5,000 is probably enough for the two of them, or the three of them rather, with his daughter. My wife and I are non-religious conservative Republicans and are increasingly worried about the future of our daughter here, and especially what they teach in American schools with crazy liberal ideologies. We are against it. We are tired of the politics here. So this is something that we get actually from a lot of people asking questions about this, saying it must be better, it must be better, it must be better in Russia. There are different problems in Russia, right? Yes, with regard to traditional values, and if that's what you want your children to be brought up with, in a way, it's going to be better in Russia probably than here in the U.S. But what was your experience, Marcus? I didn't have kids when I was in Russia, so it's hard for me to give a good answer. I know your kids went to the German school, but generally, I mean, there are different problems in schools in Russia than there are here.
Right, and there's completely different approaches. So
that's what I was getting to.
With the problems aside, you would take, the American approach is kind of like inspire children to do the right thing and do good work and reward them. Whereas in Russian schools, right? Maybe not private schools, but Russian schools, they're kind of like very strict and pressed under a lot of pressure to perform well, right? And potentially they're not like rewarded as in the US. They are rewarded, but they're kind of like they can be I don't want to say threatened, but threatened for bad behavior or
I
bad.
think it's important to say. It's important to say here. Where is this stress coming from? Is it coming from the teachers? Is it coming from parents? Because we need to make that clear. Because in my experience in Russia, it's coming mostly from the teachers, not necessarily the parents.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, the teachers, they are in general, they're very demanding. That's what I want to say.
Right.
I don't feel that's the same as in the U.S. So
no,
that's one issue. And then the second issue, of course, is this kind of liberal, progressive approach in the U.S. that people keep coming to, expatriate, let's Russia, and they're like, looking for ways to get to Russia because of the more conservative approach. So I understand actually, the initial reason with having a child and wanting to go to more of a more conservative place. But that's just one factor.
Yes.
And I felt very, I don't know, with my kids in school, even though it was a private school, a lot of the families were Russian. So I would say I felt okay. I mean, I didn't like some of the attitudes of like status. That was a thing for me. Like, many Russian families have to show their status, like their financial status.
Right.
So
I think
that was probably the biggest downside.
There's lots of cultural differences, and one of the things that kind of turned me off to Russian schools a little bit. I studied in university in Russia, so I obviously didn't go to grade school or elementary school in Russia. So I can only speak based on anecdotal evidence that I've heard from friends and my wife. And one of the things that struck me studying in Russian universities was how little critical thinking was forced upon kids. I know a lot of people in the US are going to say, oh, there's no critical thinking here either, but that's not necessarily true. In Russia, it's really you must memorize an incredible amount of information and regurgitate it, and that's it. That's the exam. So yes, Russian schools will teach you a lot. Your kids will be fantastic, history experts, but they're not going to be able to solve a complex problem or, live on their own. I don't know, maybe this is my own bias, and maybe I grew up in a much more privileged environment than I thought, but I grew up in rural Maine, and, we were encouraged to, figure out how to do things ourselves.
Well, a good example is mathematics.
Yeah.
Russians typically know math very, very well. So if you, write down a mathematical equation and say, solve this, they're able to solve it. But the difference, and Americans probably don't solve the same level at the same age of math problems, but they can implement story problems, right? And Russians have a hard time with that. Like, I don't know, a train's traveling at this speed and another one's going in this direction. When will they meet? And something like that.
Well, that's because
a Russian would have
it's this
a tough
regurgitation
time.
Of formulas and everything, right? Whereas, I don't know, Americans just have a very different mindset. So you do need to keep that in mind, that if you're going to school in Russia, if you're going to send your kids to the regular Russian schools, they're going to be brought up very differently than you were in school. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind. Of course, you're not going to have maybe some of the liberal stuff that you're worried about. But I would say that if you're going to send your kids to, a top Russian school in Moscow, you're going to have way more of that liberal, worldview than you probably are going to expect. I mean, if you're in a small Russian city, of course, there's none, right? But if you're a big worldly, Moscow high school, I think people would be surprised that they're quite progressive there as well. Of course, not the same, but you're not going to get away from it 100% if you want the best education for your child in Russia, I think. So for me, and
another thing I would point out is, okay, so in this example, she's very young. Mm-hmm. So language presumably wouldn't be a problem to pick up, right? Which is great. So it's not like, she's 16 or something and she'd have a really hard time, not only with the language, but also social, interaction. So this is, I was always, when my kids were young and we were in Moscow, they were so young that I think that's one of the best times to travel and to do something because they kind of absorb it so fast. But if you really don't want to go the Russian, school route, there is a solution to, you could potentially, teach the kid at home or do some sort of like private tutoring, or you could choose a school that you like, even if it's not well rated or, at the top, and then you could do private tutoring, and private tutoring is fairly cheap.
Right.
So that's one solution to that issue.
Right. So essentially what we're saying here is it's a bit of a deeper problem than just, I want to get away from liberal ideologies in school. I think you need to think about it a lot harder. And let's see what he says further here, because maybe he gives us some more information that we didn't get. Lately, my wife and I have been thinking about selling the house and everything we own to move to Moscow. I have my father there who owns some real estate and has done well for himself financially. He would pretty much give us an apartment to live in Moscow. We would not be dependent on him for money or a place to live, but he did offer to give us an apartment. Well, I would say on $5,000 a month, you could probably rent a pretty nice apartment, not in the very center of Moscow, but in a nice area in Moscow. So I guess it's up to him. I don't know how big the apartment will be, but and whether that will come with any strings, formally or informally. My wife, who's 31, wishes to be able to retire and be a stay-at-home mom to spend more time with me and our daughter. My wife is American and does not speak Russian, but is willing to dedicate the time to learn. That, got to be careful. I know lots of people who've gone to Russia and said they would learn Russian, and were not able to. It will really take a lot of work. I'm not a mom, but as a dad who works at home, I cannot imagine having to pick up another language while trying to raise a little kid. I don't know what your experience is, but I imagine that's going to be difficult. Now we're getting a new country at the same time.
Most people overestimate their ability to pick up a language in general, right? Not saying that they can't. It completely depends on the person and the drive and the environment. But and having a young child learning Russian, that would definitely help, right?
Sure.
And then obviously you're in the country. So in this particular situation, I think she would be okay with the support system of, the daughter learning Russian, the father speaks Russian, and her father-in-law speaks Russian, or they have some support. They wouldn't be there 24/7 to, she has to go to the store and run errands. If you're a stay-at-home mom, you still have to do those things.
That's what I was.
So that's most of the frustration, as I foresee it, where you can't do those simple errands as you would in the US. Right. But if the kid is at school, you could potentially, you need the extra time to run those errands. So, if you're a stay-at-home mom, potentially you could work through it. So I think there's a bigger issue though with just a lot of people go abroad and they quite quickly figure out that they need some sort of support system among friends. They need to find friends and speak their own language. So if you dive into Russian too much, then you can kind of feel isolated. And so if you go to a big city, then you can find other expats. And again, if the child is going to Russian school, or if she's going to any school where the mother has some sort of free time, then that can be alleviated. Right.
He says further here, I do try to speak to my daughter in both languages. It seems she understands some Russian, but it's definitely not her first language, and she prefers to speak English, as you kind of mentioned, and I would agree. I wouldn't worry about that. She's 4.5 years old, I think. So that's not going to be a long-term problem. In a year, she'll be speaking better Russian than he is probably.
Well, can I just add as I'm a linguist I studied linguistics at the university, and I teach my kids 3 languages. So that won't be an issue, but people, I think they misunderstand sometimes when you want to teach your kid a new language, it's not enough to come from you, because your relationship is typically in English, right? So here, the best approach, if you're going forward with that plan, the best approach would be to let Russian develop in school, with the grandparents, with cousins, with friends, with a nanny, anybody else, and keep your relationship, because all the change can be kind of stressful. So just take that approach.
Her parents are the only people who are going to be speaking to her ever in English if they move to Russia, right? She's not going to be speaking English in school. So you definitely need to be careful. So he says, after my last visit to Moscow earlier this year, I got back to the US and was able to get a Russian Загранпаспорт, which is an international passport. For myself and our daughter, we were also able to get my wife a 3-year tourist visa to Russia very quickly. Because I'm a US veteran, we have good health insurance here in the US and do not pay mostly for any health care through the VA. Well, in that case, I'll be honest, the worst thing about living in the US is the cost of health care. So if that's paid for, then he's got it good in the US. However, we are very tired of American politics, liberal ideology, and the things propagated here to children. We do not agree with it all. Okay. Being as I have family in Moscow, we are debating selling it all here. Renting our house is not an option. We do not want to deal with renters from overseas if we move. Plus, the market is great to sell. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think if you got a property manager, he could probably make a considerable amount of money. I don't know how much his mortgage is, but if it's significantly more, that could be another $1,000 a month in profit. So I would definitely not sell the house if it were me, but we're not financial advisors.
Well, I do agree with him with the I had a property while we were in Moscow. We rented it out. It covered our mortgage and a few, 100, $200 extra, but it was kind of a headache to manage if you don't have a management company. So if you did, definitely go through a management company. But even then, what if I'm just kind of worried about this scenario where you make the move to Russia and, you sell everything and then you make the move to Russia and it's just not really what you expect or it's not working out. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, maybe we should head back. You've already sold everything. Right. So maybe a better approach would be to do commit to a year. Mm-hmm. And make that transition a little bit more, make a slower transition. Right. Commit to like a year, see how it goes, and then while I was in Moscow, I sold my apartment in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So it's possible. You don't necessarily have to fly home to do that, but I'm just hesitant to say, okay, go for it, sell make a decision right now and go for it.
Well, what's really interesting to me is I get a lot of requests like this as well at Expatriant from people who are ready to sell everything and move to Russia. At least in this situation, Edward, our subscriber, has been there. But I've had people who've never been to Russia, and they just have this idealized idea in their head, and they don't speak Russian, and they're ready to move, their entire family, wife, kids. I just think that's crazy. And I agree with your statement that, this isn't anything, this has nothing to do with my opinion about Russia. I would say that about any country, that you should, at least go and check it out first. I mean, there's no way from forums and YouTube videos can you figure out what it's really like in Russia. Everybody has a different experience in the same situation.
Right.
So he says further, I want to emphasize that even though we're both young, we definitely wish to retire. We wish to live in Moscow, travel, immerse ourselves in the culture, eat, be around our family, raise our daughter, give her a chance of a good education, and get back to my roots in Russia. Okay, so now he's kind of getting at the heart of what he kind of wants here. It isn't that he's necessarily concerned about high cost of living in the U.S. or liberal ideology. Really, he just wants a low-key life where they both don't have to work and can live off his pension that he's already got and relax. And I can respect that for sure. I think he should have mentioned that at the very beginning.
I think that's what we've really been kind of underlining across our videos, is that is possible with a foreign salary or pension or something like that, right? The same goes for people from Europe going to Spain or Turkey or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. You see a lot of British or Norwegian or Swedish people who buy apartments in cheaper places because their pension is well, it's my uncle in Germany, he went to Spain every year for dozens of years, from Germany to Spain, and he just loved that it was obviously the weather, but also the fact that it was much cheaper than Germany at the time, for what you got. So that's nothing new, and I think this is really what he's getting to, and he's kind of worried about the other things, and those factors are kind of flexible. I mean, you can find solutions to those, like the schools and things like that.
Yeah. Well, the next thing he mentions is cost. I was also impressed by how cheap most things are in Russia compared to the US, especially food and bills like utilities and rent. And then he puts in parentheses, on an American salary. And I mean, that's the thing to keep in mind.
Yes.
things, yes, even on a Russian salary, a lot of things are cheap in Russia, but not restaurants and not food. I would say if you've got an average Russian salary, then you're not going to be thinking that restaurants are cheap or food in general. I know that's a big pain point for most Russians. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, on $5,000 a month, you're going to be fine.
Another thing I would say is if you are very used to, this American food and I mean, you've grown up in America, you have a certain kind of diet, right? So if you just up and leave and you land in Russia, you're going to be looking for things that you are familiar with, and those foreign products will be slightly more.
Yes.
Right? So, and then over time you can get used to, Russian-made products that are similar or whatever, and change your diet. But your food bill will be higher if you're buying the stuff that is familiar to you from the U.S.
Right. He says, I realize we can get much further there on my American pension, save more money, and live well on $5,000 a month, which I will continue to receive as direct deposit in my U.S. bank account while we're in Russia. Should have no problems with that. I agree. $5,000 a month, especially if he doesn't have to pay for housing, they're going to be able to live like kings. On a pension of around $5,000 a month, I realize that neither I nor my wife would have to work, but that simply is not an option here. Well, I would agree. Probably living as a family on $5,000 in the U.S. is probably difficult. Although without health care, it's definitely possible. It's more than the average American salary. Also, my dad would give us an apartment in the center of Moscow, so essentially it would be free. He mentions that a few times. I would be very careful about that personally. I have a very good relationship with my parents, but there could be informal strings attached to that apartment. You never know. So I would just be careful, especially since he doesn't know his father practically.
Temporary, like until you get on your feet. You don't want any miscommunication between families. So I would answer this scenario as, let's say you have $5,000 as in your as a pension, and then you still need to factor in rent. If at any time you live in an apartment with lower rent or free rent, I would just think of it as maybe temporary until you find something that you really want.
Right. I mean, if you're making $5,000 a month, you could easily spend 100,000 rubles a month on an apartment, and that's a 4-room apartment somewhere near a metro line. So I'm sure it would be not bad even if he had to pay for his own apartment. So I wouldn't even factor in that. I mean, from a cost perspective, he's in a very good position, obviously.
Right.
So we're traveling to Moscow in a week, this time all together with my wife and daughter, to meet with everyone and spend 2 weeks there for the new year and celebrate with family. We got to catch up with him after he's gotten back, see how he did, and explore the city in the winter. It would be my wife's first time in Russia. My wife is definitely tired of American politics and ultimately dreads our daughter going through the modern day school system because of propagated liberal ideologies taught here and agendas shoved down kids' throats in regard to LGBTQ ideas. Well, with regard to the last LGBTQ ideas, I don't think he'll have any issues in Russia.
No.
But again, maybe it's because I live in Texas, but I don't see like the crazy stuff going on in Texas that's going on in Washington, D.C., for example, or New York. I mean, one of the great things about the United States is that you can go to different places and have completely different political ideologies that kind of are part of life. And honestly, it's a bit surprising that if he lives in Florida, he's so concerned about this, because I mean, Florida is probably the number 2 state in the U.S. that's not as focused on these ideologies. But I don't know. I don't live in Florida. I don't know.
Well, I'm wondering if this is a first-person account. Like, did they have experience in kindergarten or the school nearby or something like that, versus what's being told or seen on social media and in the media. Maybe if that was a first person account, of course you'd think, okay, we need to figure something out, but if it's like you said, you're not seeing that same thing in Texas, it could be different based on the school system.
I mean, I'm not advocating
Or the
that he
school
should move to
district.
Texas. I think he absolutely should try moving to Russia. I think it would be a fantastic experience for him, his wife, and his daughter. But I just think he should be doing it for the right reason. And I think his reasons above about wanting to retire early, wanting to enjoy life, are far better reasons to move to
That's
Russia
the real, yeah.
than I want to escape some liberal ideologies. Because one thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, and that this actually is a good kind of response to what you just brought up, if the issue for him is not a firsthand experience and it's rather social media and mass media and social and the news, he's still going to be an American over in Russia, and he's still going to be using his Facebook account. He's still going to see all the same stuff. He's just going to be in Russia, you know?
Right, right.
That was one of the things that, you know, was kind of surprising to me. Yes, you can worry about it less if you're not in the US, but at the same time, you're still exposed to it way more than you think you're going to, unless you completely stop reading the news in English and using social media. So I think it's just something also for him to keep in mind. Okay, so we've got to the question here. He says, what advice would you guys give me regarding moving to Russia in this situation? Would it be a good move? Would it be worth it? I'm nervous because aside from me being born in the USSR and my last trip there, I do not know Russia. This is interesting. This is one of the big points I wanted to bring up. It's a tough decision leaving all of our comfort stateside. He vastly underestimates what comforts there are in the States compared to Russia. But our lives here are rough with no family, no close friends, and no support with our daughter. Also a good point. What do you think of that, Marcus? What advice would you give Edward on whether this would be a good move or not?
The main factor that kind of got my attention was that he doesn't have family support structure in the U.S. anymore.
Right.
And so with that being said, and obviously there's reservation changing your whole life. Going to a new country, there's always reservation and hesitation and doubt. But it's what I would say is it's definitely worth a try. Definitely, yes. Because there's no support system in the U.S. to kind of, you know, hold you there. If you can achieve the things that he stated, you know, like the wife could be a stay-at-home mom. If you could achieve those, then it's definitely worth a try. It's not that you're never going to have the option to return to the U.S. if you don't like it, right? I think a lot of people, they get to this point and they're like, oh, should I do it or not? And it's an irreversible choice. It's not, right? You still have your U.S. passport.
Right.
So
right.
It's definitely worth the try. There will be tough situations where you're like, this is, you know, even the culture, like you might not get your head around it, or it will take a long time to get used to, or you'll just have to kind of deal with it or ignore it or something. But given the details, I would say, you know, I can understand the hesitation, but there's no reason not to try it.
Yep, I would agree. And then he says here, we're drained and exhausted living this way, and know that if we leave the USA, certain things will become easier and cheaper, while others may become more complicated in terms of assimilating in Russia to a new life, especially for a certain time for our daughter, but she is still young. It's interesting he brings up his daughter, because I think his daughter is going to have the least problem of anybody in this situation.
Yeah.
You know, I think his wife is going to have, honestly, a really hard first 6 months. I mean, she's not going to be able, she's going to be very lucky that he's not working and can go with her to the store and help her do things, but she's not going to be able to do anything in the beginning, right? And she's going to have, you know, struggles with that, and, you know, and she's going to depend on him, you know, almost 100% to do anything in the first few months, literally 100% dependent on him with the daughter. The daughter is just going to be there, you know, soaking it up, learning new words and, you know, taking it in. I think the daughter will think it's great that she lives in an apartment building and there's all kinds of kids playing with her outside. I wouldn't be worried about the daughter, you know. I'm more worried about the wife, and then how's that going to impact her relationship with him. You know, when she's got it really, really tough, she's not going to have any friends. It's going to be tough for her to make friends in the beginning. Although in Moscow, at least there'll be an expat community she can get involved with and, you know, meet other Americans who feel very similar to her, which would be great. But that's what I would be worried about. I don't know why he's worried about the daughter. in this regard. But again, I didn't have kids in Russia,
Right.
only here. And I can say if I, was moving my daughter to Russia tomorrow, she would think it's fantastic. But she's only 2.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That kids are super adaptable, and it's kind of this mindset from an adult, worrying for the daughter, but it's nothing to worry about in that regard. However, I do want to point out, you mentioned that the wife wouldn't be able to do much. That's true, but in this case, as opposed to a lot of cases where foreign families move to Russia or any other country, the husband is working and the wife's at home alone. In this case, they state that they would be able to take that time, and he wouldn't be working. At least maybe they want to do something down the line, but they have that flexibility to
Exactly. No, I agree.
Adjust.
I agree 100%. They're definitely better off than almost anyone else, but that would still be my biggest concern, not the daughter. Right? Because it's not only, I don't know, maybe this is just my relationship, but I think that a lot of people just want to be able to be independent. Like his wife is going to be unable to be independent. She's going to depend on him, and she's not going to want to depend on him all the time, because I imagine now she doesn't depend on him for doing any basic things like going to the store or getting her hair cut.
Right.
And these things, it's like, I gotta take my husband to get my hair cut now. The first couple times it's probably a novelty, right? It's kind of funny. He has to sit there and translate. But after months go by, and every time this is how it goes, that's gotta create issues. I imagine. I don't know. Maybe I'm.
You're right, but if they're staying put in the same area, then she'll find her hairdresser. Sure. If she gets it the same way every time, and that's the great thing about Russians and Russia, is that a lot of expats have had great experiences with the people, right? Yeah. They're open, and once you get to know them, they're willing to help. So you go to your hairdresser, she'll know what you want, and you don't really have to say much unless you change your hair every time. Then it'll be really kind of frustrating to be able to explain it. But I think over time they'll find that it will be a very positive experience.
Absolutely.
With the time freedom that the freedom of time, freedom of money that they get.
Agreed. 100% agree. And so he says, will we be able to live well in Moscow on $5,000 a month? Absolutely. not a question. I think you're in agreement with that. He says also, my compensation from the VA is completely tax-free. Then, I just assumed that he was giving out after tax, but so that doesn't really factor into my decision at all here. Absolutely. He says he doesn't have to file taxes at the end of each year. Okay. I'm not a tax professional, so I have no idea if there's anything that he needs to do different. I imagine no, but neither of us would be working in Russia. That is a definite. My daughter and I are dual citizens. My wife has a Russian visa and is a U.S. citizen. So we can go back to the U.S. whenever we want, but if we sell our house in Florida, we have nothing to come home to. Goes back to your point. If his wife is married to him legally, then, she's got a child who's a Russian citizen too. So she can apply directly for a permanent residence permit and citizenship quite quickly in Russia as well, once they're living there. So,
right.
No immigration problems. Although he should work with an immigration lawyer, and anybody, if you need a recommendation, let us know. He says not selling is not an option. Okay, I don't know why he's so dead set on that, but if he is, then I'm not going to try to convince him otherwise. But then the next thing is, he says here, if we do sell our home and our vehicles and our belongings, we would be coming to Russia with around $250K. So it's kind of weird that he mentions that. The $250K, you could buy a decent apartment with that in Moscow as well. I don't know why not selling is not an option, because unless he's planning to buy an apartment in Russia, what is he going to do with that $250K? If he's going to invest it somewhere, then okay. But if he's just going to sit in a savings account in the US or Russia, that's a horrible idea. Better to keep the house from a financial perspective.
Right.
Okay. He asked again, how well can we live with that money? $250K in the bank and $5,000 a month. fantastically well. You'll be living better than 98% of all Russians. And then he says, now he's got some questions I think that are just based on not really knowing, but would we still have full access to our US bank accounts in order to transfer money to Russia in order to live and pay bills? Yes, of course. You'll just open a Russian bank account and you can more or less freely transfer money between them. I don't know what experience you had.
The only thing is if they sell everything and they don't have a residential address, they'll need some address for, you know, I mean, they won't, technically you can get an online account, but, you know, what's the address they're going to use for all the bank accounts that they have?
Well, and the other thing a lot of people don't think about, he'll have to get a Russian driver's license. He'll have to get rid of his U.S. driver's license if they don't have an address in the U.S. You know, it's just kind of like...
Right.
Anyway, lots of things in that regard that he should think about, and I'm not probably the best to advise because I've never been in that situation.
Well, it's not going to stop. It's not going to be a deal breaker for these minor questions, right? It's just organizational. Like, how are we going to do that? What I would always recommend, or I always recommend, that anybody going to Russia thinking that they might stay long term needs to get their documents in order before they go to Russia. Like, get an apostille of your marriage certificate and the birth certificate. Get your international driver's license 2 weeks before you leave, and just get all your documents done and you're good to go.
So the next question he's got here is, what about my wife, who currently does not speak Russian, or my daughter? Would things be easier for them? Well, for your wife, nothing will be easier about this. Absolutely nothing will be easier, other than maybe for her psyche, right? If she's that worried about what's going on in the U.S., she'll not have that to worry about, I guess. But
it really depends on the character, the personality of the wife too. Like, if
that's true, if she's outgoing, I think she'll have far less.
Then that's one thing. But if she's an introvert, and I don't know, I assume that if you work as a nurse, you're comfortable being around people and maybe even awkward situations, so maybe she'll be just fine. She'll just have to get used to not being able to do much with the language barrier.
Right. And so he kind of ends here with, my wife is tired of what's going on in America and tired of working. What advice or suggestions do you guys have? We're just overwhelmed with this whole thing and would like some opinions, suggestions, or advice. So we've given a lot of advice throughout the whole story here, but again, I would agree with what you said a little while ago, that he absolutely should try this. He has nothing to lose by trying it, only something to gain. It's going to be a fantastic cultural experience for him, for his daughter, and for his wife. I just would be cautious about cutting absolutely all ties to the U.S. without having spent a long time in Russia. And even, he's in Russia right now, and so 2 weeks there with his wife, I'm sure it's going to be an absolute blast for his wife, right? She's going to love it. There's so much to see and do, but that is not necessarily representative of what life is going to be like when they get there to live permanently. So I would just be weary about cutting all ties to the U.S., getting rid of everything, not having a backup plan in case we don't like it. But I think one of the things he should be ready for is, what do you do in a situation if he and his daughter love it and his wife hates it? Or the other way around, what if his wife loves it and he decides he doesn't like it because he says, I'm Russian, but I don't feel like I fit in with the other Russians. And his wife's like, but it's so great here. What are you going to do in that situation? I think that's going to be harder to navigate than, if it just doesn't work out overall. But those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I've seen that several times where somebody likes it, somebody doesn't. In our cases, right, we enjoyed our time. Right. Our wives not so much. You have to be able to come up with some compromise and come up with a solution. I doubt the daughter will have any negative experiences. Right. You have the income to have a comfortable situation. Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's probably my main concern.
Yeah. So, Edward, I hope that you found this valuable. If any of our other subscribers are interested in sponsoring a video like this as well, let us know in the comments and we'll reach out. We hope somebody got something from this. If you've got additional questions, write in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.
This was Ask an Expat with Marcus and Matt from an Expat's Russia. We hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have a question about Russia, let us know in the comments and we'll answer it in another video.